Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. My co-host this week is Richard Ebling. In fact, we have an announcement to make. Richard has been designated the permanent co-host, the new permanent co-host of the Libertarian Angle. So welcome to the show, Richard, on a permanent basis.
It's a pleasure to be with you. It's like coming around full circle from the time you and I were working in the early years of FFF.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that Richard was vice president of academic affairs at the very start of FFF. The earliest issues of our journal, Future of Freedom, which at that time was called Freedom Daily, contained an article by Richard and did for the next, 15 or so years until Richard became president of the Foundation for Economic Education. So Richard and I are basically on the same wavelength on most of the issues. A few little things he's wrong about, but other than that, I think this is going to be a really fun show. By the way, I got another news show you may be aware of over at liberty.me with Scott Horton of the Scott Horton Show and Anywhere.com. And that show's a little bit different format. It's based on Scott asking me questions and my commenting on the burning issues of the day as compared to the Libertarian Angle, which is more of a conversation and discussion between Richard and me. Richard, since we oftentimes discuss foreign policy and the national security state, the warfare state, I thought that we maybe ought to come back and talk a little bit about economics this week, and specifically talk about free market principles in the context of the history of economic thought. Of course, you are an economics professor. You're one of the most knowledgeable Austrian economists in the world today. And so I thought, well, here's an opportunity. I know one of your favorite subjects is history of economic thought. So I thought, hey, let's do a little broad survey course in the short period of time we have here dealing with history of economic thought. And it seems to me that there's no better place to begin than Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That seems to me was really the starting point for the idea of economic liberty, the idea that governments don't need to regulate and plan economic activity, that if you just leave people free, I'm not talking about less regulation, I'm talking about no regulation, that if you leave people free to engage in economic activity, pursue their own individual self-interest, that you end up with a society with tremendous prosperity, tremendous freedom, and that this really is the key to ending poverty. What do you think?
Well, I think we should keep in mind that before the time of Adam Smith, second half of the 1700s, the European governments, and it's basically the leading Western nations of that time, Britain, France, Spain, and so on, all had an economic system which was known as mercantilism. It basically was the 18th century version of government central planning. The government set wages and prices. It dictated the direction of domestic production. It controlled, regulated, prohibited, or commanded the importing and exporting of various goods and services. They even had sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws were the government planning and regulation of what kind of foods people could eat, what type of clothing they should wear, because everyone was supposed to know their station and state and place in the social hierarchy of the society and life. And then basically in the second half of the 18th century, there arose two schools of thought, one in France and one in Great Britain. In France, they were known as the physiocrats. They liked to call themselves the economists. And they started to develop a series of ideas, actually led by a French economist named Francois Quinet, who was one of the physicians to the King of France, one of the royal physicians. He was allowed to touch the royal body. And he basically started seeing analogies between the human body and the social order. And that is, he as a medical doctor, he understood anatomy, the physiology and circulatory system of the body. And he said, what do you see in the body? You see all these interdependent parts, the stomach, the lungs, the brain, the muscle systems, the nervous system, and so on and so forth. And each is part of a self-regulating mechanism, or an organism that is self-regulating. If one is getting too hot in terms of body temperature, your body perspires. If you need oxygen, you start breathing more rapidly. and so on. And he said, let us look at the social world. And what we can see that there is an interdependency of the parts there, just like in the body. And it's called the division of labor. There are the farmers, there are the craftsmen in the small towns. There's the king who keeps political order. There's the church, which keeps a sort of religious order in the society. And he attempted to show how the production of one part of the economy interacts and sort of feeds back to the other parts. The same time that these physiocrats were developing this, and by the way, they were consciously using the notion that government did not need to regulate anything. Just as the government or an external force does not have to regulate the interdependency of the parts of the body, other than the individual attempting to do things to see that he was eating right, not doing anything poisonous to himself, the social order could be viewed that way as well. That there was a natural order, and that if government just kept out of hands and allowed these interdependencies to be self-correcting and self-adjusting, the social order would not only be operating more smoothly, but would generate more prosperity for all, including the king, than if the government intervened and regulated. Now, across the English Channel, during those same second half of the decades of the 18th century, were a group known as the Scottish moral philosophers. The most famous being probably David Hume, who's also known as an historian and a political philosopher as well as an economist, and of course, as you're mentioning, Adam Smith. Now, what they emphasized was the idea that it's come to be known as spontaneous order, and that is that one can imagine social order without design, that order emerges from the bottom up rather than being posed from the top down. And their conceptions, and Smith summarized it in The Wealth of Nations, with the idea of a system of natural liberty. In a system of natural liberty, the government basically has three of what he considered essential functions. National defense. There are bad people who might want to invade your country and do bad things to your body and take your property. Second, domestic violence. There could be domestic private criminals, thieves, defrauders, bunkers, and the government had the responsibility to serve as domestic policing and the court system, to have a judicial system to assure that people's rights in their life and their property were securely protected and guaranteed through the court system and the policing system. And then he did believe in a third function, which he called the providing of certain social services, roads, bridges, dredging a harbor. He actually also believed in minimal government education. You know, everyone should be able to read, write, and do arithmetic. Otherwise, how can you be an informed subject of the society to therefore act in an intelligent way? But except for these functions, that's all the government was to do. Now, of course, the response to that is, so government now does nothing. It leaves people to follow their own roads, their own paths, their own directions as they want. What assures that the world doesn't go into chaos? Don't you need the government to direct farmers to grow food and see that it's supplied and distributed to where it's needed in towns and cities? Don't you need the government to direct manufacturers what type of tools, implements, and capital goods and finished consumer goods are needed, and to see that it's distributed to those parts of the country where consumers are living and what are defined as having needs of these types of goods and the amounts of them and so on? And Adam Smith said no, that if you have individual rights, that is, the individual is responsible and has the ability to make his own decisions for himself. And if you have property rights, so that the individual knows that he not only is secure in his own person, but that which he has honestly acquired through his productive efforts. And if you have a society based upon voluntary exchange, that is, no one may be coerced or compelled to enter into a transaction that they do not view as advantageous for themselves, then what recourse do people have? If you can't hit a person over the head, if you can't steal from them or defraud them, then how do you get from someone else that which you want, that you desire? Well, the only way open to you is to use your talents, your abilities, your skills, your intellectual capacities, your innovative creativity to figure out what could you produce, what service could you supply, that individual would value highly enough to trade away what he has that you desire and which you value more highly than what you're producing and giving to him in trade. And Smith argued that therefore self-interest, or as he calls it in The Wealth of Nations, self-love, is now harnessed to a wider common good. Of course, he's not using common good the way many people in the day say about, government ordering us to do things or setting social goals and purposes, which we're all compelled through taxes and regulations to follow. By a social good, he's talking about sort of the sum or the cumulative impact of the betterment of all individuals as individuals in the society. And therefore, if individuals are left free but have to only deal with each other on voluntary basis, then everyone sees it that it is in their own interest to be innovative, creative, industrious, hardworking, etc., to serve those in society. And therefore, as if by an invisible hand, individuals will apply themselves to make the things that others want in society, not through compulsion, but in their own interest to attract them sufficiently to give them in trade what those others have that they, the individual producer, want. And therefore, through this, the economy generates order, coordination, and directed productivity. Now, from Adam Smith, this continues through the classical economists of the 19th century. Such economists as the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say, or David Ricardo, or Nassau Senior, or John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. Now, it would be an exaggeration and historically inaccurate to say that all of these economists believed in a very strict laissez-faire. No, they didn't. They made exceptions. They argued that there were certain circumstances for government to be involved, and so on and so forth. But what you can say is that looking over the classical economist system of the 19th century, their default position, if I can express it that way, is that individuals know their own interests better than any statesman or politician or bureaucrat sitting in a faraway capital could ever presume to know better than themselves. That individuals will have a greater interest to apply their knowledge, ability, and skills to improve their own circumstances through serving others in the marketplace than when government is directing them, because success or failure is dependent upon how well they apply their talents, abilities, and resources. If others buy your product, you get what you want and earn a profit. If you have misjudged, individuals may not want to buy your product, and you don't make a sale, and therefore do not acquire the goods that you desire and may suffer a loss. And therefore, all of them share this general conception that the market should, in broad sense, be left spontaneously alone for a self-coordinating pattern and coordination. Then finally, in the latter part of the 19th century, you see the development of a different approach known as the marginalist approach, which we really don't need to get into in this context, most highlighted by the Austrian economists, beginning with Karl Menger and his two followers in the late 19th century, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk and Friedrich von Wieser. And particularly Menger, too, emphasizes this idea that most of the social institutions that we take for granted, language, law, custom, tradition, etiquette, mores and morals, and things of the marketplace, such as money, are not the result of human action, but in fact are the result of human action, but not of human design. This is a phrase that he took actually from one of the Scottish philosophers, Adam Ferguson. But the idea is that all of society, in fact, emerges in this spontaneous way without the need for government or the direction of government, and in fact would be more harmful if the government attempted to do so. And that then set the stage for the later developments of this market approach in the 20th century, with the only difference is that while economists such as the Austrian economists in the 20th century, particularly Ludwig von Mises, whose picture is right next to my head there, or Friedrich Hayek, whose face is just right there, and some members of what are known as the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman and others, they took a generally free market approach. But there emerged in the 20th century a counter-revolution against these things. First, there was the Marxian socialist who wanted to reimpose a form of central planning of their own type. And then, of course, in the 20th century, there arose other economists who argued that government needed to intervene, to regulate, government had to redistribute wealth. And, of course, then the Keynesians who believed that the market economy is inherently unstable and you need government to use its monetary and fiscal tools to keep it on even keel, because otherwise the market will fail. So that gist, in a very brief way, is the evolution of economics and the profound importance of the idea of markets and freedom generating liberty and prosperity without the heavy hand of government.
Yeah, that's a really nice synopsis of the history of economic thought in 15 minutes or so. If we go back to the pre-Adam Smith era, I agree with you about that highly regulated society, that people really believed that this was necessary. I mean, if government didn't require a certain number of sweaters to be produced in the realm, how would you know that the private producers would produce enough sweaters for everybody? Everybody freeze to death. And I recall that there were laws on markets in the villages as well, that there were laws against middlemen, because middlemen were seen on preying on the poor within the inner cities, or the inner villages. And there were anti-speculation laws, where you're not permitted to buy low and sell high because you're profiteering. And it's so fascinating that we see that same mindset today. So when Adam Smith comes along, I mean, it's truly a revolutionary picture that he's painting here. We're so accustomed to the idea of, at least the wording, free enterprise, free market. But it was really a revolutionary idea. It shocked the world. Ironically, it was done in the same year. It was published in the same year as the Declaration of Independence. So you've got now these two major revolutionary ideas, that you don't want government regulating economic activity, that this is really what's keeping people down. And then to combine with the idea that Jefferson's writing about, that people have fundamental rights, including liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And those come together in some pretty big ways in the United States in the 19th century. And as you work your way up through the classical economists that are coming after Smith, people like Mill and Ricardo, there's also Bastiat in there. I mean, Bastiat has this fantastic essay on how Paris gets fed, where he says, notice that here in Paris, you've got all these foodstuffs coming in every morning. You wake up in the morning and, my gosh, the stores are filled, the streets are filled, and there's no central planner. There's no government official that's directing all this. It's all because, as you mentioned, each person is seeking his own self-interest. He's figuring out what his talents are in life. He's getting involved in the division of labor. He's entering into trades with others. Through this process, money, the concept of money in direct exchange, starts coming about. And then ultimately that leads to the marginal revolution, as you talked about, Jevons, Valra, Menger. And how about the phrase laissez-faire? I mean, we hear that all the time, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Let it be, let it pass, which was essentially the same notion, wasn't it, Richard?
Well, yes. There's a story. Some have said it's true. Some say it's apocryphal. But supposedly during the mercantilist period, under the French royalty of the earlier part of the 1700s, one of the French ministers in charge of the French economy, a fellow named Colbert, called in some French merchants and businessmen and asked them, how can we, that means the government, how can we help you be more prosperous? And according to the story, one of the businessmen said, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. That is, let goods be free, both in terms of their buying and selling and in their passage. That is, no restrictions on trade. And supposedly that's the origin of the phrase. I'm not sure if anyone's ever pinned it down, but that's the story. Now the idea is that and it's important to realize the danger of the caricature. You see, what the socialists and the interventionists already in the 19th century who reacted against this free market revolution were saying is that, these people, they don't believe in laws, they don't believe in any rules, and that was never the case. Whether you read the French physiocrats, whether the Scottish moral philosophers like David Hume and Adam Smith, whether you read the classical economists or later on the marginalist economists and the Austrians, all of them realize that society cannot function without a conception of rights. Now, do those rights come through natural law, natural rights? Do they come through a sense of social efficiency, a consensus about what rights an individual should have? Later on, what's called utilitarianism. But whatever it is impossible to have a functioning society in which individuals are recognized as having rights with others should not and cannot be allowed to violate. And that the core element of this is private property that has been honestly owned either through peaceful production or through voluntary trade, and the securing of all contracts that have been entered into to see that words are kept for the purpose of consistency and expectations of being secure in one's life and person, and therefore being able to feel secure in the present, as well as being able to plan ahead. All of them believe that. Now, that notion, of course, is what people rebelled against. You had 19th century people like Thomas Carlyle. He was a reactionary conservative who called it just money making and money greed. And these economists of the 19th century never said that. When they spoke of self-interest, or even Smith's phrase, self-love, they always meant it not as a caricature that somebody only cares for himself, is willing to hurt others to get what he wants. They always believed that self-interest meant whatever the individual considered of value and importance to him: family, friends, community, associates, even one's country. But the point is that however the individual chose to define what was important to him in this broadest, and not necessarily always in the narrow monetary sense, the individual knows best what is of value and importance to him. And he, in his own circumstances in the society, can be a better judge. It doesn't always mean he makes the right decision, but that he is a better judge of how to go about pursuing those desires and interests than anyone who attempts in a faraway capital to regulate from afar his life and activities.
Well, and even more than that, what I found fascinating, and especially among the Austrians, which, as you point out, beginning around 1870 with the so-called marginal revolution, is that when people pursue their self-interest, they end up benefiting mankind, even though that's might not be part of their intention. I mean, you take a guy like Bill Gates and say, I mean, the guy is a great benefactor, but let's say he's not. Let's say he's just a greedy, profit-seeking, selfish, self-interested person. In order to acquire all that wealth, he has to provide goods and services that other people are willing to pay for. And so in the process, the state of mankind, the standard of living of mankind is raised by people that are benefiting mankind when that might not even be part of their intention. And so when you combine these two things, self-interest along with voluntary charitable activity, where people are being caring and compassionate with the money they're accumulating in the marketplace, it's the best answer for poverty that one could ever find, because who's going to help the poor in a totally impoverished society? Nobody's got the means to do that. Now, let me also go back to the classical economists, because among those were Karl Marx. And a lot of people don't realize, I think, Richard, that Marxian philosophy in terms of value really is rooted in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. I mean, the Wealth of Nations, I would never recommend anybody to read as a first read. I think it's a very difficult, turgid, difficult to comprehend book. And I think the major accomplishment there was not only putting economics together in a systematized study, but also these radical revolutionary ideas of free enterprise and free markets. But that Marxian concept that the value of any item is based on how much labor goes into producing it, and therefore the capitalist, the employer, isn't contributing anything to this process, that he's stealing. When he takes profits, he's stealing what rightfully belongs to the worker. That I think is rooted in Adam Smith, and of course is rooted in the classical economists. And that was the real revolution in around 1870 with Jevons, Valra, and Menger, wasn't it?
Yes, you see, Adam Smith developed, and he wasn't alone in this, but he popularized it. It was then taken over by the leading figures of the classical school, particularly in Britain, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill. And the conception is that what is the basis of value? And they looked around, they said, well, some products have wood, some products have metal in them, but what do all products have for their manufacture? Well, labor. Somebody has to do something with the wood and metal to make it into a good. And the conclusion was, therefore, that if we want to understand what determines the value of goods in the marketplace, that is in terms of each other, how many hats for a pair of shoes, how many pair of shoes for a suit of clothes, and that type of thing, then they had the misguided conception that we can find its source in the quantity of labor that had gone into its manufacture. So if it takes 4 hours to make a suit of clothes, but it takes 1 hour to make a pair of shoes, then 4 pairs of shoes should trade for 1 suit of clothes. Now, what happened was that Marx, taking a series of ideas that he had gotten from others, came to the conclusion that, well, look here, if labor is the source of all value and all production, then who is this businessman who sits in his office and he doesn't work on the shop floor? He's not extracting metal from the ground. He's not cutting down a tree. He merely because he owns a factory, merely because he owns a factory, he asserts the right to claim a part of other people's labor. If I can use this sort of caricature, the man knocks on the door of the factory bumper, and he says, Sir, my family is starving. I need a job. Well, lad, I will let you in my factory, and I'll let you use my machines. And if you make 10 units of output during the day, I am a benevolent person. I will let you keep 7 units of the output. And for having allowed you to enter my factory and use my machines, I get to keep 3. Isn't that fair? Yes, sir, as long as my family doesn't starve. Yes, sir. Now, Marx is, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Okay, but Marx concluded that merely because the guy owns the factory and sits on a desk with his feet up on the desk smoking a cigar when that was still politically correct, he has a right to that which is the labor of another. That's Marx's basis of exploitation. That is really and that premise runs through all of the interventionist and redistributive policies up to today. It is the underlying premise of our President of the United States, Barack Obama. When he says businessmen to businessmen, you didn't really make it, okay? That it's the product of others. He's basically saying is that the businessman is claiming more than his right because the workers have made it. Other employees have made it. It's not really his. Now, I'm not saying that Barack Obama is a conscious, intentional Marxist, but he, like most others in society, tragically, Bumper, is the result of an intellectual milieu. Schooling, the media, the cultural ideas of the intellectuals, the people who were his advisors as a student, all of that resulted in imbibing this presumption of the left that businessmen are greedy, exploitive, and callous, and harm others and do not deserve all of what they have. And that arises from Marx. As you said, the later marginalist revolution, that is Menger, Jevons, Walras, other Austrians leading up to the modern Austrian school and other economists, also that value is not based upon the quantity of labor that's gone into it. A person could spend his entire day at the beach making mud pies in the sand. But if there is no one who values buying a mud pie, it doesn't matter what quantity of labor has gone into its manufacture. What determines value is, to use a phrase that all of us have heard of, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Value is subjective. It's based upon the individual's judgment and evaluation of what he thinks something is worth. And therefore, because the product has worth, what he thinks someone's labor might be worth to assist in the manufacture of the good that he would like to use and enjoy. So value does not run from a quantity of labor to a product, but it's the subjective valuation of a product that then is imputed to what a worker's labor might be worth. And in the market, entrepreneurs cannot exploit, entrepreneurs cannot cheat. Why? Because as long as the labor market is free, open, and competitive, competitors are competing. And they must offer any worker not just matching what others are offering him, but something that then approaches what, in his mind, the worker's labor contributes in value terms to the manufacture of the product that the consumers want. And therefore, modern economics, this marginalist or subjectivist approach, turned the classical economist theory of value on its head, and in the same process refuted the entire Marxian conception of capitalism as exploitation.
Yeah, well, let me just make one correction to what you said. If somebody's making pies on the beach, those are sand pies. They're not mud pies. A little humor there, Richard. But on the subjective value theory, another correlation of that is the idea that when people enter into trades, they give up something they value less for something they value more. Otherwise, they would not enter into the trade. So in every economic exchange, people are improving their standard of living. And this is what is lost on a lot of the statists today. They don't understand that. It applies in labor relations. You've got this minimum wage law that is locking out of the labor market untold numbers of people, especially black teenagers in the inner cities. People don't understand that if it weren't for the minimum wage law, those black teenagers could compete against the well-to-do white counterpart, where they say, look, I'll work for less. I'll work for $5 an hour, get my foot in the door, learn a business, learn a trade. And if they do that and the employer says, hey, I can make some money off this $5 an hour, yeah, that sounds like a good deal. If they both enter into the transaction, they're both benefiting because they're both giving up something they value less for something they value more. And this is one of the really keys to economic prosperity, isn't it, Richard? Just free trade? Isn't this what Smith was talking about also?
Right. The core conception of exchange in a market is that as long as the voluntary and free consent is required of the transactors, it is a positive sum game. That is, I win and you win. If I spend this time with you on this show today, it's because I value more highly your company talking about these issues than other things I could have done with my time. I know it's hard to believe, but obviously I value my time more highly than the cost of other things I could be doing now. You see how much I care for you, Bumper. Anyway, but you are absolutely right. Okay, this is the core concept. Trade is a positive sum game. Now, what we need also to point out, at least before we finish today, is that people do understand that not everything that happens in the marketplace is free and voluntary and openly competitive. And this is what causes the confusion, partly distorted and partly justified, is that all they see is the market, and they see honest and ethical businessmen earning their livelihood by making goods that consumers want and competing for the resources that they hire for its manufacture. But they also see other businessmen, the people who want favors, privileges, monopolies, trade restrictions against foreign rivals. And they see that some people earn money not by making the better mousetrap at the lowest price, but by restricting the competitor from entering his corner of the market through a regulation, a trade barrier, some type of a special tax that makes it prohibitive, and so on. And therefore, we need to be very careful in saying that the capitalism that we want is a laissez-faire and free market capitalism, and not the crony capitalism, to use this widely popular phrase, and justifiably, this crony capitalism in which government works with special interest groups to rig and manipulate markets at the disadvantage of workers, at the disadvantage of otherwise free market competitors, and most certainly against the interests of the consumers, who, when these regulations, restrictions, and prohibitions and protections are put in place, result in consumers having less variety to choose from, higher prices than they otherwise could pay, and a denial of their freedom of choice. And we need to make sure that is not, those two things are not confused. There's free market capitalism of the type we've been spending this time talking about today, and the distorted, manipulated, politicized crony capitalism, which creates the ability for people on the left to say, you see what capitalism is? You see? That these special interest groups just use government, and that's what has to be done away with. And we need to make that distinction. I'm sure you totally agree with me.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because I think that most Americans have just been indoctrinated, especially in the government schools, into thinking that what we live in and what they've grown up in is a free enterprise system. And if you did a survey of people, they'd say, oh, of course we have a free enterprise system in America. Well, this is not what we envision when we talk about a free enterprise system. What we're talking about is a system where economic enterprise is totally free of government regulation. I mean, the phrase I would use is a separation of economy and the state, just like we separate church and state. We don't have the government regulating and subsidizing churches in any respect. That's what we want with the economy, just get government out of the way entirely. Richard, unfortunately, on that note, we've run out of time. Great time with you this week. Welcome to the show on a permanent basis. And if you have any suggestions, those of you that tune in on what you'd like to see the show cover or how you think you'd like it better, drop me an email at jhornberger@fff.org, and we'll look forward to sharing ideas on liberty with you all in the future. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week.